Hello everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I wanted to talk about a subject that feels like it's gaining quite a bit of steam just in the past few months: the use of psychedelic substances for therapeutic goals. And so this was a study that was published in one of the most prominent scientific journals in which scientists can publish their work, Nature. And so it focuses on how humans, specifically, have been using these substances for non-recreational purposes, microdosing specifically. And so let's get started. So this is a study, it's really a survey that's focused on microdosing. And so I suspect it might be helpful to sort of get on the same page regarding what exactly microdosing even is. And so in a nutshell, microdosing is the practice of using substances like psilocybin or LSD, but at doses that are fractions of what people would have typically taken, like in the recent past. And so they take such small doses because they have a totally different goal when using these substances, right? They're not trying to like blast off into the stratosphere with an altered state of consciousness. They're just trying to sort of subtly nudge the activity in their brain in pursuit of some kind of salutary effect. And the effects can range quite a bit when it comes to microdosing. And so it can be improved mood, enhanced creativity, enhanced emotion or motivation. And I've seen descriptions that are more sort of like pragmatic, right? Things like improved productivity at work. And obviously, things like creativity and mood and motivation would all be involved in pursuit of increased productivity, right? But other practical pursuits of this kind of thing is confronting psychiatric conditions like depression or substance use disorders. And so right at the outset, I just want to be totally clear. I don't think that there's remotely enough evidence, the studies we're about to explore included, that would justify microdosing with these substances to try and manage psychiatric conditions. And so, like depression or substance use disorders. We're just not quite there yet. And if you're interested in a discussion that's more dedicated to the broader topic of microdosing, I have a link to one that I did almost exactly a year ago down below. And I get a bit more into where the whole practice sort of started. But anyways, the point is that it's the use of rather small doses of these substances relative to what people have used in pursuit of some kind of positive effect. And so when it comes to what these doses tend to be, they range, but somewhere around 5 to 20 micrograms of LSD or 0.1 to 0.3 grams of psilocybin containing mushrooms. And so people typically consume those micro doses a few times every week. But one of the sort of difficult aspects of this topic is that none of this has really been very well standardized. And so I get into more of just how much variability there is and how different people do microdosing in that video linked below. And there are plenty of sources of variability, right? Like even just between psilocybin containing mushrooms, that might be used. There's a whole bunch of different mushrooms that produce psilocybin. And, given that they all have different concentrations of the active ingredient of psilocybin. But even beyond, the purely pharmacological sources of variability, like the literal dose that's taken, there's also just not sort of a standardized frequency at which, doses are taken. And so is someone taking 0.1 grams of psilocybin containing mushrooms every other day? Or are they taking 0.3 grams on Sundays and Fridays? It varies. And I'd absolutely love to see a study that actually standardizes all of that stuff. But beggars can't be choosers, so let's get into the study that we do have. And so, like I said earlier, this is essentially a survey. But the only reason I didn't, just read it and move on is because it's a fairly large survey that spans more than one country, though the majority are in North America. And I'd have loved to have seen a greater, geographic disparity in the countries that participated. But first, they were using a website or an app, microdose.me, which is kind of cute. And so it looks like they were limiting the participants to people who had Apple devices, and specifically iPhones. And they were working with the Quantified Citizen app, which I've recently downloaded. And so as a recent PC Android only user, I suspect that kind of sort of selects for a certain cohort of individuals. That's a whole different topic. I'll leave it to you to consider, what kind of a selection criterion might result in who, ultimately ends up in, the sample of people who included in this study, right? Only Apple users. But at a minimum, it is certainly a limitation that only Apple and iPhone users participated. Anyway, so everyone was at least 18 years old, makes sense, could speak English, and the whole thing is self-reported. And so anyone who's interested in these kinds of studies is almost certainly seeing tons and tons of limitations kind of piling up, and I couldn't agree more. Self-reported explanations of basically anything that humans do very limited in how reliable they are in terms of, accuracy. We're kind of like amusingly bad at explaining why we do the things that we do. But once again, beggars can't be choosers when it comes to studies that investigate microdosing, and there are some vindicating features of this study as well. So everyone did a baseline assessment, right, where they were at the beginning of the study. Participants came from in order of most to least. And more than half came from the US, but the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, and Denmark. And so the survey started with 8,703 people who completed the whole survey process, right? Which broke down nicely into 4,653 who do not microdose and 4,050 who do currently microdose, or currently at the time of the study. And then 4,541 of those completed an assessment of their sort of psychiatric condition, right, called the 21 Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, or DAS. It's a DAS score, right? And then they trim down the respondents a few more times according to a couple other selection criteria, but let's just get into it. So just to give you a sense of what these kinds of questions, what kinds of questions are asked to get that DAS score, here are some of them. And so you can see questions about like a person's experiences during the past week, right? Questions like, I found it hard to wind down, or I was aware of dryness in my mouth, or I couldn't seem to experience any positive feeling at all. I found it difficult to work up the initiative, to do things. I was worried about situations in which I might panic and make a fool of myself. And then there are, some more kind of intense ones, like I felt I was close to panic, or I felt scared without any good reason, and I felt that life was meaningless, right? And so anyways, you get the idea, right? It's a set of questions that kind of range from pretty innocuous to more intense, and you answer on a scale of 1 to 3, right? And it's just basically to get a sense of where people are emotionally, psychiatrically. And so that's what they were using to quantify changes in, psychiatric states for people who either were or were not microdosing. So let's get to the results. So when it came to people who did microdose, they were able to get a sense of what exactly they were literally doing, right? I mean, just saying you microdose, we don't know precisely what that means. And so they broke down the doses that people were taking into low, medium, and high, based on what studies were done in the past on microdosing, what the typical dose ranges had been identified as being. And so for LSD, low qualified as 10 micrograms, medium was 11 to 20 micrograms, and high was above 21 micrograms. For psilocybin, and this was clearly just all psilocybin-containing mushrooms, right? It wasn't like they broke down to like ones that were taking only tampanesis and ones that were only taking cubensis, right? All psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Low was lower than 0.1 grams of dried mushrooms, medium was between 0.1 and 0.3 grams, and high was over 0.3 grams of dried mushrooms per administration. And so they also collected information about the other substances that would be consumed, right? Alcohol, cannabis, and nicotine, as well as whether people had engaged in non-micro doses, of the typically microdose substances. In other words, if they were taking full-blown psychedelic doses of these substances. And so when it came to the schedule that people followed, the majority of the participants were evidently microdosing between 1 and 4 times per week. And yeah, it was mostly LSD and psilocybin that were being used. Most people are doing it in pursuit of enhancing emotional well-being and cognitive functioning. Those are like the two main reasons that people said that they were microdosing. And so here are the overall results that they collected from asking, all these people all these questions. And so the results were basically equivalent across males and females. Not always the case, but in this case it was. And as you can see, people who were not microdosing consistently report higher scores on that depression, anxiety, and stress scale, right? Which you can see in the orange bars that are, always higher. People who were microdosing had lower scores on those measures, right? Particularly, again, depression, though all the results were statistically significant. And so, in other words, this group found a relationship between microdosing and reduced anxiety, depression, and stress. And in fact, they claim that this is the first study that demonstrates associations between microdosing and reduced severity of each of those affective states, anxiety, depression, and stress. And so, I've read quite a few of the studies that focus on microdosing, right? There aren't all that many, to be totally honest. But I'm not 100% certain that this is true, that it's the first one that's nailed this down. But this study did strike me as being the first that so confidently stated that there's an association between microdosing and reduced symptoms of anxiety, depression, and stress. Though, and they acknowledge this, the effect size, like just how substantial a difference there was in anxiety, depression, and stress, that they found in this study was pretty small. Like, it wasn't a giant effect, but it was an effect nonetheless. And so the group also found that among the people who were microdosing, they tended to be quite a larger proportion of them who were doing so, who were microdosing. They were doing so with the motivation to address mental health concerns, right? That was like the thing, the reason, their motivation. And the authors, the scientists, are appropriately cautious when they bring this up, highlighting astutely that some actual clinical trials would need to be done to actually sort of swim in the waters of recommending this kind of a thing. This is not a clinical trial. What we want is a clinical trial, to specifically answer the question as to whether microdosing is effective to reduce psychiatric suffering. And so, kudos to them for acknowledging that. Another interesting finding: the group who was microdosing were less likely to drink alcohol regularly and were more likely to just never drink it at all. Not only that, but they were less likely to consume nicotine as well, tobacco, e-cigs, and so on. And in fact, over 25% of the people who responded to their survey said that they were microdosing specifically to reduce the negative effects of using other psychoactive substances. Not necessarily the main reason or the only reason that they were doing it, but certainly one of the consistent reasons. Pretty interesting. However, microdosers were quite a bit more likely to consume cannabis and use it regularly. And so not only that, but they were also likely to indulge in the use of high-dose psychedelics, right? Like full-blown or traditional doses that produce the sort of psychedelic hallucinations and so on, right? And that kind of makes sense, really, right? If someone has enough of a supply of these substances to take them that regularly and measure them out that precisely, I'd speculate, and it's just speculation, that there are two things that are true about them. First, the first time that they were exposed to the substance was likely a full-blown psychedelic dose, right? The first time that they were exposed to it probably was not a microdose. Second, they have access to sources of the substances, right, that are sufficient to enable, whatever dose they'd like to consume at any time, right? And I only bring this up because, noting these trends sort of implicitly suggests, or it leaves the door open to implying that it might be possible that folks who microdose are just more predisposed to consuming substances in general, be it cannabis or psychedelic substances. And so in other words, just from a nature-nurture perspective, right, I'm just trying to highlight that nurture, or a person's environment and their surroundings and life experiences, may play at least as significant a role in determining these trends, right, that they're more likely to consume full-blown doses, they're more likely to smoke pot, or not necessarily smoke, just consume cannabis. So, nurture or the environment plays at least as significant a role in determining those trends, if not a greater role, frankly. But again, totally speculating there. Another thing that this group notes, which is pretty cool, is the people who were microdosing tended to combine the substances. Typically psilocybin or LSD. And psilocybin most of the time, that was like the most common one. But anyways, they tended to combine those substances with something else that is not psychedelic, right? And so things that they mentioned included the very interesting lion's mane mushroom, which, as you can see, is a very strange-looking mushroom as far as mushrooms go. It's also called monkey head mushroom, bearded tooth mushroom, satyr's beard, bearded hedgehog mushroom, the pom-pom, right? Great names. And you can sort of see why, right? It's a strange-looking mushroom. There's a whole lot of ethnobotany surrounding this particular fungus. People use it for a variety of reasons, but I've never really seen actually any evidence that it does much of anything. Though some of the descriptions make me very motivated to try it. Check this out. So this is from Cornell University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Quote, "The taste of lion's mane is highly desired by chefs and is said to resemble lobster and seafood." How cool is that? So given that, I think lobster is one of the greatest flavors of anything on planet Earth, I will very soon be zealously pursuing some lion's mane mushroom, even figuring out if I can just grow it, because that would be a dream come true. But anyways, there have been a lot of claims about lion's mane, right, regarding its like pharmacological effects. But I haven't seen, very scrupulous demonstrations of those effects, whether or not it would have any kind of effect or influence the nature of the effects of a microdose psychedelic substance. It's one of those things that's been used for like 1 billion years, right? And it has a bit of a history. But anyways, it was things like lion's mane, niacin, things like that, right? That were combined with the substance that was being microdosed. That was very common among the people who were microdosing. And so an interesting component of what it is exactly that these folks are consuming, right? It's not just the substance itself, it's combined with something else that isn't necessarily psychoactive but may or may not influence how the substance is metabolized. So for example, just because, let's say, whatever, lion's mane, I don't know this for sure, but there could theoretically be a molecule in lion's mane that influences your digestive enzymes, right? And that could theoretically influence, if it influences the same component of our metabolism, our enzymatic metabolism, then that could influence how we metabolize the psychedelic substance. Totally just a possibility. They didn't really explore that. But anyways, there aren't all that many studies that have done something like what this group did, right? With this simple, survey-based approach. So it's interesting. An association between microdosing and reduced anxiety, depression, and stress. That's interesting. Also, as someone who's read kind of like innumerable studies like these, I always appreciate the writing that scientists kind of use to like decorate the actual science that they did. And so, so there's, an example of a quote from their study. And so here's a quote. These long-standing indigenous health technologies have been subject to centuries of aggressive suppression, first through colonization and the Inquisition of the Americas, and later by the US-led war on drugs. End quote. Hell of a sentence. Without any obligation to acknowledge the broader context in which these molecules are being studied and are being used, this group did, and I appreciate that. They acknowledge that kind of stuff. And so, adding some accurate color to the portrait they're painting, right, with an experiment is, in my humble opinion, not only a good thing to do, but also a helpful, scientifically helpful thing to do for a grad student who stumbles on their paper, while trying to build a scientific argument that involves how these substances have been used in our recent past, right? That's an important component of the relationship that people form with substances. Another limitation of this study is that some of the members of the not currently microdosing group actually did have some past experience microdosing. So let's just spitball, right? Some potential problems that presents. So let's just be super duper optimistic and imagine that microdosing with these substances isn't only rather effective, but it actually delivers therapeutic effects even after a short period of microdosing, right? Let's say somebody only microdosed for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. And there's a therapeutic effect, and that therapeutic effect lasts for months or even years, resulting in extremely long-lasting alleviations of psychiatric distress. Let's just imagine that that's possible. Now, I don't think that's actually the case, but if it was the case, then the control group for this study, the group who was not currently microdosing, would include some people who benefited from the effects of microdosing in the past, which, to be clear, would suggest that the beneficial effects of microdosing described in this study underestimates the magnitude of the benefit of the reduction of stress, anxiety, and depression. So, that is just a potential limitation of the way that they set up their control group. I imagine it's kind of difficult to find people who are interested in microdosing who've never tried it, right? So anyways, there's actually another study that I wanted to discuss today, which I'll probably touch on next week because it is very dense and nitty-gritty, unless something else amazing comes out that I can't help but explore. But the short story is this study, which, once again, is also published in one of the most highly regarded scientific publications out there, Science. And, I just have to say, this is a hell of a study out of the University of Heidelberg. But anyway, so this group did a ton of work, and, I'm criminally abbreviating that work, but this group found that psilocybin, the main substance that was being microdosed in the above study, the first study, psilocybin appears to target a component of the brain that appears to be like damaged or diminished, reduced by chronic alcohol use. It's a glutamate receptor, and it looks like the administration of psilocybin was capable of restoring that specific thing that's targeted by chronic alcohol use. Again, a specific glutamate receptor, mGlur2, mGlur2, metabotropic glutamate receptor 2. Chronic alcohol use diminishes the availability of that receptor in a specific part of the brain. And it looked like the animals with whom they worked in this study, this one right here, demonstrated improved cognition, after alcohol exposure, and also it seemed to have rescued that thing that alcohol use targeted, right? That glutamate receptor. So in other words, they have evidence that not only could psilocybin be beneficial in the context of alcohol use disorder, but they've even honed in on a potential mechanism, right? The thing that causes an effect in the brain, we call that mechanism, that could explain, why it might be that psilocybin may deliver some therapeutic effects in the context of alcohol use disorder. Really cool. Definitely planning on diving into this rather complex study next week. But okay, so let's finally address the question, right? Is microdosing a good idea? Well, a year ago, I sort of discussed the same question. And even, given these data, I think the answer is still essentially the same. There's just not quite enough actual hardcore evidence that is beneficial for the reasons, right, that people are consuming them and for the people who tend to gravitate towards doing so. But the evidence in support of the idea does continue to grow. What we need is a classical clinical trial, a study that intentionally explores the effect of one or more of these substances at the kinds of doses that are being consumed normally, microdoses, right? And that's what it'll take for me personally to really feel confident in entertaining the idea that there's something to this, something real and tangible and therapeutic. But if I were placing bets, right, at this point, I'd probably bet that those clinical trials would be supportive. And so the closest thing to a clinical trial that I've seen is this image of a study. And so it's an interesting study that was published in March of this year. So, one of the many studies that had to adapt to the limitations imposed by the public health crisis. But this is the largest placebo-controlled trial on microdosing that I've seen so far. And the short story, well, here's a quote from the lead scientist on the study. Anecdotal reports about the benefits of microdosing are almost certainly biased by the placebo effect. Right? So basically, this study found no significant differences between people who were, taking actual psychoactive microdoses, right, compared to people who were just taking placebo. That's the benefit of a placebo-controlled study. Everybody was taking something, but only some of them were psychoactive or psychedelic, right? And so the picture's still kind of unclear. The first study we discussed isn't an ideal way to perform a study like this. It's not an actual clinical trial, but it still is pretty interesting, and a lot of people participated. Not the highest quality data, but data. And so, interestingly, there is an active clinical trial right now exploring some potential benefits of microdosing for specifically frontline healthcare workers who've experienced significant stress over the past year and a half or so for understandable reasons. They're focusing on microdosing with ketamine, which is an interesting choice, and not pharmacologically associated with the effects of substances like, psilocybin or LSD. They don't really share many effects. But it's at least an indication of growing interest in exploring whether there's something to this. And by the way, I as I said, I downloaded the Citizen Science app. Where do I have that here? And Quantified Citizen app. And it's interesting. I mean, right now you sign in, right, and I can see 3 studies that are either underway or are upcoming. And so I'll give you an example. There's one that's a microdosing study that's been paused, observing microdosing effects on cognitive performance and mental health. Another one, updated microdosing study revision being prepared. So the microdosing study is on pause while we prepare our new app. All submitted data has been received. And then there's there are others, right, that you can just sign on to. Again, these kinds of studies would be limited by self-reporting, right? Self-reported data is never really considered to be the highest quality data. When it comes to psychiatric, changes in psychiatric states and emotional states, it's kind of hard to do anything better than self-reporting, right? Because, I can tell you, I feel super happy, but what I qualify as being happy may not you might call exuberance, right? Or you may be nonplussed by what I consider to be happiness. It's tough to do much better. Maybe fMRI, these types of things can just sort of add a non-self-reported component to these kinds of data. But anyways, if you're interested, check it out. Otherwise, I'll be keeping my eyes peeled for further developments in this domain of microdosing. I find it a fascinating approach to trying to very subtly nudge one's brain states, one's cognitive states. And so I'll be keeping my eyes peeled. If you dig this kind of conversation, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will be here next week with something new. Thank you for watching. Hey, Scott. Good to see you, man. Hey, and I apologize for most likely missing the majority. Your mother has COVID. Oh, jeez. I'm so sorry to hear that. We don't know when or how she contracted it. We're both fully vaccinated. That's good. Her doctor cited her age as the primary reason it was getting her, but I am racked with guilt that I didn't spot it sooner. Oh, you should certainly not feel that guilt. It is the world in which we're living, you know. And, you know, as a part of what I do now, you know, I track trends in COVID, you know, positive test rates. They're increasing everywhere. Philadelphia has probably, among like large cities, I think Philly is like the 6th biggest city in the country. Among other large cities, Philly has done remarkably well, just comparatively. I mean, we could all have done better, right, over the past year and a half or so. But even in Philly, they're starting to pick up again. You know, this variant, it spreads really, really rapidly. And, you know, there's not much I can say, right, that I'm sure would put you at ease. But vaccination makes a world of difference, you know, in terms of how severely people respond, particularly people in that age demographic. But listen, man, I'm sorry to hear that. You know, I can empathize with that kind of anxiety. Okay, K Dan says, between LSD and psilocybin, did one seem to be more effective than the other? That is a very interesting question. The study wasn't set up to be able to do that. I bet that they do have those data. So here's what I bet would happen, you know, as somebody who's like, you know, written studies, right? I bet that they did do that comparison, that, you know, they knew who was taking what. They did report that the majority of them were taking psilocybin. So it may have just been the case that like the vast majority of them were taking psilocybin and just a very small cohort were taking LSD. LSD is harder to obtain, right? It's harder to make, harder to obtain. And so it could just be that they had so few people taking LSD microdoses that they just didn't feel comfortable. They didn't feel confident in comparing it. It wasn't an apples to apples comparison, right? Or they did do that comparison and they didn't love the result. That would be my guess, you know, that perhaps it was that. And again, you know, they did not include this in the study, but, you know, these are the kinds of things that, like, if they were to come, you know, here and present their publication, these are the studies, or these are the questions that other scientists in the crowd would ask. Like, was it the case that when you pooled all of the microdosers, all the people who are actively microdosing, you saw this effect, right? You saw this effect, right? Where people who are microdosing consistently had lower DAS scores, or, you know, anxiety, depression, and stress. But if you removed psilocybin from that group, or you removed LSD from that group, it was no longer significant. In other words, it could be the case that only psilocybin was effective and LSD was not, or vice versa. You know, like another potential scenario is that if you pool them all together, you get this significant effect, right? But one of them actually isn't effective. Let's say psilocybin is not effective, but the vast majority of them took psilocybin. But LSD was dramatically effective, right? That, you know, there was like, if you were to just compare LSD microdosers to non-microdosers, the disparity in the bars would be enormous, right? It could be the case that's how it went down. And then and it was enormous enough that when combined with the psilocybin cohort, that, you know, that combination pulled down the disparity, but it still remained significant, and they didn't want to make that claim. They didn't want to make the claim that LSD is more effective is effective for microdosing while psilocybin isn't. These are just possible contingencies that went down. My bet, just given how similar, the pharmacologies of LSD and psilocybin are pretty similar. They're not the same, they're very different molecules, but they're pretty similar. And so, you know, I would be very surprised if one of them was effective and the other one wasn't. I would be surprised if that was the case. And you know, the same goes for other, you know, serotonergic psychedelic substances. You know, I could imagine there being a difference with something like mescaline, which has a bit more, it has a bit more of a stimulant effect, given that it's a phenethylamine. It looks a little bit more like amphetamine, for example. Or any of the other like halogenated, you know, substituted amphetamines, you know, 2CI, 2CB, and so on. But my bet is that they're all pretty similar It just so happens that psilocybin is so much easier to get. It's now being essentially decriminalized or legalized in certain states in the United States. So, internationally, it's a very different world. But, there is this wave of legalization of psilocybin. And, you can just grow it, right? You don't have to, synthesize it. So the synthesis of LSD is extremely difficult, or at least involved. So anyways, that's what I would imagine happened, is that they did do this comparison, and for whatever reason, it wasn't interesting, or it sort of, changed their story in a way that they didn't feel confident in articulating. Again, imagine that only LSD was effective, psilocybin wasn't. And again, if they pooled them all together, LSD was so effective that it made it so that everybody who was microdosing had lower, anxiety, stress, and disorder. But it could be the case that only 15 of the many thousands of people who participated did LSD microdosing. And so a study where you have 8,000 people in the beginning, participating in this study, and then it broke down into 4,000 basically in each group, and only 15 of the 4,000 who were taking, microdosing were taking LSD. That would be a ridiculous study, right? So anyways, and it certainly wouldn't have been published in Nature, I can tell you that much. But anyways, my bet is that they didn't feel confident for one reason or another in making that comparison. Another, I know I'm going probably on way longer than you would have been interested in hearing, but another thing is that it could be the case that more than 15 people were taking LSD microdoses. Let's say 300 of them were, right? That's a good number. That's a real number. But it could be the case that the way that they were microdosing, the doses, the frequency, all that kind of stuff was so disparate, it varied so much that you're sort of comparing a Fuji apple to a Golden Delicious or whatever, where it's they're just kind of different enough to make you do I feel confident in this? If somebody's taking a microgram, and whatever, somebody's taking 40, 50, 60, 100 micrograms, right? They consider 100 micrograms. 100 micrograms is basically a full-blown psychedelic dose of LSD, but they consider that to be a microdose. It could be that the data were so variable that they just didn't feel comfortable. But to answer your question, they did not answer that question. And I bet that there's no big difference there. Scott, I'm just hoping she pulls through. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the assurance. I can't help feeling awful. Yeah, I mean, well, of course. Yeah, I can only imagine. There's not much I can say except for if I were in that situation, I would ask about, do they have the monoclonal therapeutics? Do they have access to, despite the fact that it seems to be the case that the approval of the Merck therapeutic, molnupiravir, and now Pfizer has one too, it turns out that it may be the case that the Merck therapeutic isn't quite as effective as it was sort of initially published to be, when everybody, had a collective orgasm, when we heard oh, finally there are therapeutics. But I would bring that up, just ask, does she have access to monoclonal, therapeutics? Because it does seem to be the case that they help. And depending upon which variant to which she was exposed, at this one, probably Omicron, it can make a difference, particularly, in that age demographic. I'm just saying that's what I would bring up. I'm not saying that this is certainly not medical advice, obviously, but it is what I would do. Anyways, sorry, man. I hope she pulled through too. Let me know. Update me. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you for watching, everybody. Thanks for hanging out. Microdosing, I find it to be an interesting topic. And I'll be here, next week, maybe speaking about microdosing again, but a far more nitty-gritty, sciencey, the kind of science that I used to do, study. So maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.